Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this very first WADA webinar on how to develop and implement a more effective testing program. Coming to you live from Montreal, this is a special session for NADOs and RADOs, and it's part of a series of code implementation webinars that we at WADA will be hosting in the lead up to the introduction of the revised code at the start of next year. First of all, a few introductions. My name is Ben Nichols. I'm the Senior Media Relations and Communications Manager for WADA and the moderator for today's session. I'm delighted to be joined by our presenter for today, Stuart Kemp, who is our Deputy Director for Standards and Harmonization at WADA. And alongside Stuart, we also have Tim Ricketts, the Director for Standards and Harmonization, and Rob Keeler, the Director for Education and NADO-RADO Relations. So welcome to Stuart, Tim, and Rob. Following Stuart's presentation this morning, we'll have an extensive question and answer session, about 30 minutes or so. So we invite everyone who's participating this morning to type in your questions as we go along, and we will get through as many as we can. If necessary, please state who these questions are directed to so we can attribute them as well. And I'm pleased to say we are also trending on Twitter this morning, so you can join in the live conversation using the hashtag WADAWebinar. And we'll tweet some of the highlights of Stuart's presentation over the next 30 minutes or so. So without further ado, I will hand over to Stuart to take us through today's topic. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Ben, and good morning to all. Thank you for joining us. Good morning to some, good afternoon to others, and perhaps good evening to some of you as well. As Ben said today, what we're trying to do is provide some guidance in the area of developing, implementing more effective testing programs. To give you a brief outline of the session today, first of all, what I'd like to try and do is highlight some of the key changes from the International Standard for Testing that's in effect today to the new International Standard for Testing and Investigations, which will take effect in January, as you know. In particular, I'd like to highlight some of the things that we believe will make the standard more effective and help anti-doping organizations make their own programs more effective, and speak more generally about what the principles are relating to effectiveness in anti-doping programs. This includes, in particular, conducting a risk assessment so that we're sure we're implementing programs that are proportionate to the risks at hand. I'd also like to speak a little bit about what constitutes smart testing or intelligent testing, two terms that we often throw around without necessarily understanding what that means. I'd also like to spend some time discussing the other and additional resources that WADA has available to support anti-doping organizations in implementing programs, given that really today we'll just be scratching the surface on the topic in only 30 minutes. And then, as Ben said, we've got plenty of time for questions and answers for myself, for Tim, and Rob. So a good starting point for this presentation is just to remind ourselves about what Code Article 5.4 discusses. And that is that it's a requirement for anti-doping organizations to develop an effective program, one that's prioritizing between different areas. And this is really the crux of what we'll be discussing today. So I think there's perhaps three key changes between today's standard and the standard of 2015 that are worth considering. The first is that there's much more emphasis in the ISTI on conducting a risk assessment so that we have specific anti-doping programs that reflect the real risks of a particular sport, or in the case of a NADO, the various sports under the jurisdiction of that NADO or RADO. So this means conducting a risk assessment to see which disciplines are of the highest risk and what substances and methods that are on the prohibited list are most applicable so that we can allocate our resources most effectively. In addition to the testing itself, the code changes see an extension of intelligent testing to the actual menu of substances and methods that are being tested for, and this is something that we'll touch on later in the presentation. And then finally, there's more emphasis on strategy in testing, and in particular, the use of the Athlete Biological Passport Program, and occasions where it might be necessary to store samples for further analysis. And again, we'll touch on this in more detail later in the presentation. So those are the requirements in the code and the standards that I think we need to highlight today, but how do we do this in practice? Well, first of all, the testing standard for testing and investigations, puts much more emphasis on the collection of data so that the risk assessment that we're putting together is informed by real information, by real data, not on perceptions of risk. And then, of course, the standard itself lays out a detailed process on how to conduct this risk assessment. And as you may be aware, WADA has also just published new guidelines on implementing programs that includes further guidance on conducting this risk assessment. You'll all be aware of the new technical document on sport-specific analysis that sets minimum standards around the analysis of particular substances and methods that aren't currently tested for at an acceptable level today. And in practice, another way we achieve effectiveness is that we implement proportionate programs, that we're using the appropriate tools to address the appropriate risks. If risks are greater in competition, for example, we need to be doing more in-competition testing. If risks are out of competition, we should be doing more testing there. Really, the new international standard for testing and investigations acknowledges that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach for every anti-doping organization, and that the only way to find out what type of tools, what type of program you need to implement is to assess those risks, those real risks. And also by conducting actual smart testing, which we'll talk about later on. I think some of the principles behind what constitutes an effective testing program are also worth considering. We talk a lot in the anti-doping community about coordination, and this is key because if we're going to be effective, it also means that we need to be efficient with the limited resources that we have. So this means, for example, international federations, NADOs, major event organizations like the IOC, the Pan Am Games, and other events, as well as national federations, WADA accredited laboratories, and WADA itself, working together cooperatively so that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing and we're working together effectively and efficiently. So coordination is certainly a key to effectiveness. Another key is that programs are based on facts, and in particular on scientific facts. As I said, we don't want to conduct a risk assessment based on purely perceptions, but we want to do it on reality to the extent that we can. And this means working closely with scientific expertise, and in particular the WADA accredited laboratory network, so that we can identify doping trends that may be out there, emerging substances that may be abused, as well as working with these labs to establish detection strategies for the most at-risk athletes and sports. Once we have done that, I think then we're in a position to be able to choose the right tools for the job so that we can identify different populations of athletes that may require more deterrent-based testing, perhaps a sophisticated athlete biological passport program, or other resources, even including greater awareness around education. So, just to talk briefly about the risk assessment. First of all, we need to look at all the different inputs that go into a risk assessment. These are the areas where we need to collect information to validate risks, to move beyond the perception of risk to see what they really are. To walk through them briefly, we've got research and information on doping trends. This could be academic literature, it could be scientific literature related to the performance attributes of a sport, much of the type of information that was reviewed in the development of the recent TDSSA. This would also include the physiological demands of sports and disciplines, where we're able to attribute the potential use of substances and methods to a particular sport where it would be most beneficial, and that relates to the possible doping effects of a substance. We also need to consider what potential financial awards or other types of incentives might be in place for particular sports, disciplines, and athletes in particular for them to engage in doping behavior, because of course financial incentives may be key to identifying athletes most at risk for doping. It's worth considering too, of course, the doping history or culture of a particular sport or discipline or nationality, not to paint all athletes with the same brush, but to some extent where there is smoke there is fire, and it's worth targeting the limited resources that we may have available where the risks potentially lie. And then another area where we can collect information on risk factors has to do with ongoing information or intelligence that we provide, that we collect through different means that may target resources further. Part of the risk assessment also requires that we look at which athletes need to be tested most frequently. How often, for example, depending on the potential doping strategies they might be engaged in, there may be an appropriate number that's higher or lower. We also need to look at which substances would potentially be abused so that we're testing for the right substances at the right time. I mentioned before that the technical document for sport-specific analysis sets out minimums, and that's all they are. So the risk assessment should be informing anti-doping organizations to what extent they should be going above and beyond the TDS-SA and testing the right athletes at the right time for the right things. We also want to look at an athlete's profile to understand when they might individually be at most risk for doping in terms of the stage of their career, whether they're trying to hold on to a career or trying to move beyond an amateur to an elite level, for example, where incentives to dope might be greater. And then, of course, we need to correlate an athlete's training schedule, their competition schedule, to identify the times that they might be most likely to engage in doping behavior so that we can test at the right time. There's certainly no easy recipe to understand when necessarily to do a particular test, but if we can understand these types of variables, then we can look at individual athletes and individual sports and try and set out our own testing scheme for those types of situations. The main point of conducting a risk assessment is that at the end of the day, we're going to be putting our resources where they're most warranted. And this increases the certainty of catching cheating athletes and deterring others when they see that programs truly are effective. So we've reviewed some of the most important risk factors, but we also need to understand how we can collect some of this data and make sure that we have systems in place to collect information on an ongoing basis so that if we see risks are changing, that our test distribution plan can change on the fly to reflect that. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we call predictive risk factors. So these are generalizations that we can make about different populations of athletes. And these were in the chart that we looked at a few slides ago. The physiological demands are certainly something that we can assess for large pools of athletes, whether an athlete is at the elite level or at the very junior level in a particular sport. The physiological demands are going to be much the same, and we can correlate that to the substances and methods that that sport or discipline may warrant testing for. Same goes for financial rewards, but of course this would be subject to the level of competition that an athlete is participating and competing at. And when we talked about the political or cultural considerations, this includes looking at known corruption or the perception of corruption within different countries or regions, for example. And again, not to paint all athletes with the same brush, but the likelihood that there might be corrupt practices within sport is higher where there's corrupt practices in other aspects of society. So those are predictive factors that we can attribute to general populations, but when we look at athletes more individually, there's much more data available to us to help inform testing strategies. The first, obviously, is the Athlete Biological Passport Program, the ABP. By testing an athlete regularly, both through the hematological module and through regular urine testing that provides us steroidal data, this can help inform our strategic testing for particular substances and methods when we see red flags on athletes that may perhaps be engaged in doping behavior. Another thing to look at, of course, is the performance history of a particular athlete, looking for drops or peaks, spikes in an athlete's performance over time. This may be indicative of doping. It may be attributable to other things, but it's certainly one red flag we can consider for targeted testing. And this is important to link to the testing history. If an athlete is performing at an exceptionally high level, having never been tested before, then it would be good cause for testing going forward. Another consideration with individual athletes is their whereabouts location. Where are they? Are they training in a region? Are they living in a region known to have had athletes in the past committing doping offenses? Are they trying to be off the radar, for example, in locations that are difficult to test in, either because of visa issues, travel issues, or just the geographical location is difficult to access? This might be a red flag. Also, irregular whereabouts patterns. Athletes are afforded every opportunity to update their whereabouts because, of course, we all acknowledge that athletes are constantly on the move for training and competition, and they have the right to update their whereabouts information as late as possible to reflect those movements. However, we should be on the lookout for irregular patterns. If an athlete has a history, for example, of constantly updating their whereabouts at the last minute, this may be a signal that perhaps they're trying to avoid testing, and we need to consider that. Also, looking out for athletes who may be withdrawing from competitions where you expected them to be participating. Perhaps this might be an instance, for example, where the athlete had a substance in their system that would remain detectable, and so they withdrew from competition. And this is not to be cynical about all athletes that meet some of these criteria, but again, if we're looking to point our limited resources where they're going to be most effective, we have to look for these red flags if we're going to run effective programs. We also want to look, for example, for athletes that are associating with coaches or physicians that are known to be engaged in doping behavior in the past. You know, for example, that the revised code has a new anti-doping rule violation called prohibited association that will certainly deter athletes from associating with known coaches and physicians and other support personnel who have committed an anti-doping rule violation or have a criminal conviction related to doping. But these types of associations can be very loose, but it's something to consider when targeting specific athletes for testing. And then, as I mentioned, we need to have mechanisms in place to collect other intelligence, whether this is a tip-off line or establishing relationships with other organizations that may be of benefit to us. So once we've conducted this full risk assessment, both on the large global predictive factors as well as the individual risks of specific athletes, now we need to convert it into a real test distribution plan. So this is about using the right tools for the risks that we've identified. These are the general steps that the ISTI outlines about developing a test distribution plan, and which are fleshed out in even greater detail in the new guidelines that are available on WADA's website. What this means is identifying the global pool of athletes that are going to be subject to a NADO or a RADOs authority, and then prioritizing between them. We can't test them all as much as perhaps we'd like, so we need to prioritize the resources we have. And this doesn't mean starting with a big test number and figuring out how to split it up against the population, but rather it means conducting that risk assessment to see how often those most at-risk athletes need to be tested and working backwards to see how many tests you actually need to conduct. So the test distribution plan is a product of a risk assessment and not the other way around. For NADOs and RADOs, obviously you've got a lot of sports and disciplines under your jurisdiction, and so you do need to be somewhat ruthless in prioritizing between sports and disciplines, and also between the athletes that are participating in those sports and disciplines in terms of their own individual risks. We then need to work out the sample analysis that's going to be required of these athletes, and this also includes, of course, determining the relevance of in-competition versus out-of-competition testing. Just because a competition is taking place doesn't necessarily mean testing should occur. It may be that those resources are better used in an out-of-competition environment, and this needs to really be considered carefully. Once we've walked through that entire process, it's only then that we identify the athletes that we need whereabouts from. Whereabouts is a means to an end, and so we need to identify the amount of out-of-competition testing that we want to do based on that risk assessment before we understand the number of athletes we want to collect whereabouts from and the type of whereabouts we'll need to get effective tests done. And coming back to the principles of effectiveness, of course, all of this needs to be done to the extent possible by coordinating with other anti-doping organizations, especially in the case of NADOs and RADOs, communicating with IF so that we understand what testing plans they're considering for athletes that have mutual jurisdiction, athletes where they're being tested by the IF and by the NADO or the RADO. When we're establishing that overall pool of athletes, one of the first things a NADO needs to do is to define what constitutes a national level athlete and make this information available to other anti-doping organizations so that they understand which athletes will be the focus of attention for the NADO and for the RADO. We also want to identify that lower tier of athletes that may be subject to testing and significant testing, but who don't necessarily meet the definition of national level athletes. At the end of the day, we also want to make sure that the definition we create is one that's consistent with the resources we have. We don't want to create such a large pool of athletes that are national level and who might be providing whereabouts, for example, if we're not going to be testing them regularly. So the program that you're putting in place should really reflect those definitions. WADA would also strongly encourage NADOs and RADOs to consider allocating resources to testing international athletes that may be in your country or in your region for a period of time that are at risk. especially if you've communicated with the relevant international federation and you are aware that these athletes are perhaps being under-tested and you have an opportunity to test athletes that are in your country. As you know, you won't be the results management authority necessarily, but you have every right to test an athlete in your country out of competition. When we're looking at the relative risks of doping between sports and disciplines, again, we need to consider the resources, but another thing to consider is the number of athletes actually participating in those sports. The greater number of athletes participating, we would assume the greater number of tests need to be applied, but that needs to be limited too by some of the factors involved in those sports and disciplines, such as the national context. So for example, the risks of cricket in a given country are going to be higher or lower just based on things like the popularity of the sport. So this means that one NADO may identify the risks of a particular sport or discipline being very different than others, because while they might have the same physiological risks, for example, they might have very different financial risks or other factors to consider in different environments. When we get sort of from the macro of how we're going to deal with this global population of athletes into more individualized testing programs, we need to start thinking critically about who to test, when to test, how to test, and that sort of thing, which means identifying a pool of athletes that we're going to be looking at most closely all the time, almost implementing a micro TDP for the highest risk athletes, so that we're not just ticking a box, making sure somebody gets tested X number of times a year, but rather you're getting those tests done at the right time. And that means allocating significant resources to that. But again, if we're going to be effective, it's worth taking the time to monitor the highest risk athletes, highest risk group of athletes very closely to see that you're implementing a program for them that's appropriate. We talked too for the need of smart testing, but more so smart analysis. The starting point to that is the TDSSA, which, as you know, sets out the minimums around particular substances and methods that must be tested for national level athletes. But because it's only a minimum, we need to understand the potential risk of abuse for some of these special substances and methods in more detail. So this means figuring out the division between in-comp and out-of-comp testing, and then considering the volume of urine tests, blood tests, ABP tests that might be appropriate, as well as these additional analyses that are set out in the TDSSA, such as erythropoiesis stimulating agents, growth hormone, and then additional substances such as insulins, and there may be peptides or other substances that you work with your laboratory on identifying the most at-risk populations and implementing those programs accordingly. We also need to understand that there are limitations to the analytical capacity of some laboratories, and this means we need to understand that for the highest risk athletes, it may be worthwhile considering retaining samples frozen at a laboratory to do further analysis at a later date. And this is, again, coming back to the need to consult with scientific experts to understand, for example, if there's a pending test that hasn't yet been validated that might be relevant to a particular athlete or group of athletes, but you can't do the test yet. It doesn't mean that you don't collect the sample. You collect the sample, but you keep it for a later date. This is already happening today. Many of you are aware of the growth hormone samples that have been collected and stored and reanalyzed, many of which have included adverse analytical findings. But we need to extend this idea into a real test distribution plan, so it's not something that's reactive, but something that we're thinking about in a long-term strategy. I'll just touch briefly on whereabouts, only because, again, whereabouts is a mean to an end. It's not something you do for the sake of it. Whereabouts should only be collected from athletes that you plan on testing regularly, especially out of competition. And WADA would certainly recommend that you adopt a pyramid approach. That if you think about a pyramid, that at the top of the pyramid, these are athletes that you're focusing on most intently, that you're testing most regularly, and they're the ones that you would need the most whereabouts from. If you're going to do smart testing, it means doing testing on your terms, not on when the athlete happens to be available. And if you're going to pick and choose the time to test, you need to know where they're going to be at all times. So we would expect at the top of the pyramid are the athletes in your registered testing pool who you're testing 3 or more times out of competition a year. Below that, the requirements that you're asking of whereabouts should really be proportionate to the volume of tests that you plan on conducting these athletes. And you may, for example, wish to consider the collective the collective activities of a team, for example, or any group of athletes that are training together. And most importantly, coordinating this information with international federations. Much more detail is available on this topic in the guidelines, and I'd encourage you to familiarize yourself with that if you haven't had a chance. Regarding that cooperation, just want to quickly emphasize some of the points of why this is so important. First of all, it undermines the anti-doping movement, certainly with athletes, when we're conducting redundant tests, when different agencies are showing up shortly after one another and an athlete sees that we're not coordinating our activities appropriately. That's doing us all a disservice, and there are ways to make sure we're coordinating, not just by establishing relationships between ourselves and NADOs, RADOs, and IFs, but also recording completed test information promptly in ATOMs and sharing your plans with different organizations when that's appropriate, when the chances of redundancy in testing is even greater. There's no reason not to be reporting this stuff quickly into ATOMs. Just to speak quickly about what constitutes smart testing, it's not rocket science. It really just means using the available information you have to do smart testing. We need to move away from the idea of random testing. There is a place for some random testing because it provides a level of deterrence, but we have limited resources, so it makes sense to do our testing where the risks are greatest. And we need to be on the lookout for some of the red flags that present themselves about testing the right athlete at the right time. A few examples are listed on this slide, and again, detailed further in the guidelines, which are worth considering when you're looking for these red flags. It's important that we touch briefly on the second I in the ISTI, given that we are talking about intelligence or information. This doesn't need to be sophisticated for all NADOs and RADOs. Again, it's just about putting together some mechanisms and processes to collect information and exchanging it within your anti-doping organization and to apply it to a good testing program. This means building relationships, for example, with regulatory bodies, be they customs or police force, advising your sample collection personnel, your doping control officers, on what to be on the lookout for in the field, intelligence that they can collect. They're your eyes and ears, and they're certainly your communication vehicle with athletes. So it's not just what they're saying to athletes that's important, but what they're hearing from athletes and support personnel in the field. They need to be bringing that back to you so that you have an awareness of information that might help the effectiveness of your testing program. I'd just like to end quickly on what additional available resources are out there for you. And obviously many of you will be aware of resources that are provided by your own organizations, by iNADO and other organizations, but there are many resources that WADA has to assist you with implementing effective testing programs. Foremost is ATOMs. You're all aware that ATOMs is intended to reflect the requirements of the code for all of us, and it does that effectively. You're also aware that WADA is undertaking a significant overhaul of the system, and we are considering many of the revisions between the IST and the ISTI about how to improve the system, and we would encourage your ongoing feedback so that we can make sure that the system, the new system launched in 2016, reflects the needs of the NADO and RADO community. So please, if you have ideas, if you have advice, share that with WADA. More specifically, just earlier this week, the revised guidelines to support the various standards for 2015 have been released, and this includes guidelines on implementing effective testing programs, guidelines on result management hearing and decisions, new therapeutic use exemption guidelines, updated athlete biological passport guidelines, and given now that every organization runs a passport program, whether you know it or not, if you're collecting urine samples, you're running a passport program. It is important to familiarize yourself with this document to understand how to deal with the steroidal module of the ABP, and WADA is always on hand to support you with those efforts. The sample collection personnel training and accreditation guidelines have been updated, and the education guidelines have been significantly overhauled from their last version. And the technical procedures around urine collection and best practice for blood collection and breath alcohol collection for those ADOs testing in the applicable sports have all been updated. They're all on our website, and we'd encourage you to review those documents over the next few months as you update your own policies and procedures for the new year. Finally, just want to remind all organizations that WADA has various toolkits available for training and additional resource, and constantly launching new electronic learning programs, including the new Alpha program, which is relevant to all organizations. And if you have questions about that, I know Rob Keeler would be happy to entertain those. So again, we've only scratched the surface today, but I do hope that some of this information has been helpful to you, and I would encourage you to utilize some of the resources that I've mentioned to get more information in these areas. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll now pass back over to Ben.